Hey everyone, you're watching GamerBrain, and let's look at 8 failed gaming consoles laughed off the market. Number 8. LaserActive. The LaserActive console was released in 1993 by the electronics company Pioneer. It used Laserdisc technology at the time, which would later develop into Blu-ray technology and DVDs, and this was all before PlayStation or even the Sega Genesis. People were really impressed with the technology, and it looked as though LaserActive might actually become a promising competitor in the video game market. By 1995 though, it was already history. The LaserActive gives us an important lesson in video gaming history. If you are going to develop a game console, keep it simple and don't make a million add-ons. The basic LaserActive unit itself could only play basic movies on Laserdisc. If you wanted to play games, you would have to start buying add-on parts that plugged into the console itself. Panasonic referred to the extra pieces of hardware as packs. What was really cool about the LaserActive was that it could play other systems' games. You could play Sega Genesis and Sega CD games, for example, and even certain PC games, but they required a different add-on. Even the LaserActive's original titles required a separate add-on, pack. In other words, you couldn't just take it out of the box and play it. A quick side note, there were even these 3D goggles that you could buy that kind of looked like the virtual reality systems that are just coming out now. It could even let 2 players sing in 3D at once, which was pretty unheard of for the 90s. Anyway, there's no doubt that the LaserActive was way ahead of its time, maybe even a little too ahead of its time for the average gamer to get into. The graphics and games were top-notch, but the pack expansions got expensive really quick. Not many people wanted to shell out $700 for a system that had $600 add-ons. 2 years after its release, Panasonic quietly cried in the corner and let Sony take over the CD-based games market. Number 7. The Neo-Geo. In the 1990s, an arcade was the only place to see the best graphics that video games had to offer. Or at least that's what most kids thought. Truth be told, there was one home console in particular that could produce the same amazing graphics that you were always spending your allowance on every weekend at the arcade. It was called the Neo-Geo, and it was the best console that no one had ever heard of. The graphics were amazing and the games were great as well. The arcade ports looked identical to their counterparts, and the controller was a regular gamepad that felt solid. Or you could buy a Neo-Geo arcade stick for the ultimate home experience. Still, if you had told someone that they could have played Street Fighter 2 in their own home without sacrificing any graphics or gameplay, they probably would have thought you were lying. Even though the console was around from 1990 to 1997, hardly anyone knew about it. The main reason why was because it was insanely expensive. It was well over $600 to buy a Neo-Geo, which was bad enough, but the games retailed between $300 to $400 each. Seriously, they may as well have dipped them in rubies and gold while they were at it. The 90s was a good time for the world economy, but no one was shelling out that amount of money for video games. Still, the small amount of people who did buy the system gave the company enough of a revenue to barely scrounge by. Eventually, the console's developers at SNK came out with a cheaper version of the Neo-Geo that sacrificed some of the graphics for more affordable games, but by then, it was too late. Number 6. The 3DO. In the early 1990s, Trip Hawkins was the CEO of Electronic Arts, and he knew that the CDs were going to become the future of gaming. He wanted to get behind a new gaming system that would beat out the cartridge-based systems from Sega and Nintendo, so he started heavily investing in a game developing studio called 3DO. On paper, it seemed like there was no way for the 3DO console to possibly go wrong. Trip Hawkins had brought together top minds from Panasonic and Creative Labs to help develop a console that was next-gen in every imaginable way. It was supposed to have 3D graphics, up to 8 players at once, and better hookups for a much clearer picture. So, what did go wrong? First of all, the asking price was absurd. For the first version of 3DO, they actually wanted $700. Keep in mind that this was in 1993, which means that $700 was more like over $1,000 in today's value. Meanwhile, a Super Nintendo was available for $200, and the Sega Genesis was about $350, and that came with the Sega CD too. Trying to convince your parents to buy a Sega Genesis or a Super Nintendo was tough enough, but convincing them to buy a 3DO basically took an act of God. As a result, you'd only hear about some kid who knew of a kid who actually had a 3DO. This person usually lived in a distant neighborhood and was probably entirely made up. The people who did buy 3DO were disappointed when big game titles like John Madden were delayed. The 3DO also had long load times, and people also didn't like how the CDs could get smudged and not work, unlike cartridges.
$50 for a crappy game, just because it's, did I die? Oh, I think it's an error.
When the Sony PlayStation hit the market in 1995 for a fraction of the price at $300, it spelled the final blow for the 3DO. Number 5. Atari 5200. The Atari 2600 was one of the most successful video games to ever be released. It arguably shaped the video game industry for years to come. The Atari 5200, however, was pretty much the exact opposite. This clunky console was about the size of a coffee table and cost $189, which is basically $550 in today's money. It also had hardly any good games and bad controls. The original Atari's controller was much better. It was just a simple joystick with a single button. This new version had a gigantic controller with a knob that you could twist, along with a full telephone keypad. The sharp corners dug into your hands, and the controller itself broke all of the time, which is just what you want from a video game console. That same year, ColecoVision hit the market and sold 500,000 units in less than 4 months. The system could handle arcade ports and even play Atari games. The Atari 5200, on the other hand, had less than 70 games, and most of them were the same games that players already had on the original console. 2 years later, Atari discontinued the 5200 and slowly backed away. Number 4. N-Gage. In 2003, the Nokia phone company decided they wanted to take a stab at the mobile gaming market. After all, how hard could it be, right? Within 2 years of its release, Nokia would already be admitting defeat with the N-Gage. Even before it was released, people were laughing at the concept of the N-Gage. Nokia had no reputation as games developers, and the concept of playing games on your phone was not really taken seriously back then. Honestly, Nokia knew that the N-Gage was not going to sell well, but they decided to push forward anyway. They wanted the N-Gage to be the first model in a series of mobile gaming phones, and they thought that it would look better to release the N-Gage than to pull out of the project just months after announcing it. They didn't estimate just how poorly the N-Gage would sell. Less than 3 million units were sold worldwide, pretty much crushing any dreams of a successful series of mobile phones. Still, Nokia bravely pushed on with the N-Gage QD, the second model in its series. This time, the general public was too busy shrugging their shoulders to even bother to laugh. Nokia took the hint and quietly went back to making regular phones. Number 3. Pippin. In 1995, Apple teamed up with the Japanese toy makers at Bandai and with Motorola to develop a console that would attempt to do the unthinkable. It aimed to replace the PC entirely. The Pippin was marketed in Japan as a machine that would bridge the gap between PCs and consoles, once and for all. It could play games, it could instant message, it could connect to the internet, and it could fail horribly within 2 years by 1997. Although exactly what happened, I'm still getting a little ahead of myself. Let's talk about the games first. There were only 18 total, and the most popular one was called Exotic Sushi. This supposed game was literally just a cookbook with sushi recipes. I mean, we're not exactly talking Mario 64 here, which is what Pippin was competing with at the time. The graphics could be described as falling somewhere between the Super Nintendo and the Sega 3D, which was fine for the time, but the console's performance was laughably bad. You could be staring at a load screen for as long as 3 minutes before anything happened. This alone was simply unacceptable. Its messaging system was a joke too. The dial-up modem ran at 14.1 kilobits per second, which meant that it took a person in Japan about 10 minutes to send a message and receive a response. You could just use a phone instead. The Pippin also had a really bad design that had slots for upgrading memory, just like you would with a PC. The last thing kids wanted to do in the 90s was disassemble their console, so this was yet another major drawback. The death blow, however, was its outrageous price. Apple wanted $700 for what basically amounted to the slowest computer you've ever had, and without Windows. The N64, on the other hand, was selling for $199 at the time. Tough decision. Number 2. Gizmondo. Do you remember those crappy 90s handheld games made by Tiger? They were actually wildly successful and hardly a console, so I couldn't include them on this list. However, if you've been wondering what the Swedish company Tiger has been up to since then, well, let me tell you about the Gizmondo. That name rolls off the tongue about as well as the consoles rolled off the assembly line in 2005. Just 1 year later, the Gizmondo was already kaput. The problem with this console is very similar to that of the Apple Pippin in 1994. It's just trying to do way too much at once. Tiger wanted the Gizmondo to be a mobile phone, a multimedia player, a GPS unit, and lastly, a gaming device. A god-awful gaming device. Let's take a look at the buttons. There's a double squiggly line button, a tic-tac-toe button, a button that looks like prison bars, and of course, circle. You've got to love the normal circle. Can you imagine trying to put the Contra Libs cheat in with this setup? Meanwhile, the direction pad is just one big blob of a button that you press down on the corners of. As any gamer knows, this design sucks immensely. Just looking at it, you can already tell that trying to press diagonally is going to be impossible. As for games, the graphics look okay, but the sound is really poor. The little speakers have no bass, so everything has a sort of chipmunk-like feel to it. The titles are a mix of bad ports and weird original titles that don't really go anywhere as far as gameplay is concerned. From its initial release to its subsequent marketing, this was quite a flop. Shortly after the Gizmondo launched in America, Tiger messed up their own momentum by announcing that they would soon release a newer version with an even bigger screen. Most of the people held off from buying the original Gizmondo as a result, and then the newer version was never made. In fact, less than 25,000 units were ever produced, making this not only one of the worst mistakes in gaming history, but also probably one of the biggest mistakes in the history of Sweden. Number 1. The Virtual Boy. Nintendo's Virtual Boy was a virtual bust as soon as it hit the market in 1995. The hype that Nintendo put out at the time was unbelievable. Advertisements were everywhere. You couldn't go to the store, watch a television show, or even eat a box of cereal without seeing at least one commercial. According to the ads, the Virtual Boy was going to be the console that would usher in true 3D graphics. The console that was going to show you your favourite characters in a way you've never seen before. It was the console that made you and your friends go crazy with anticipation just by mentioning the name. Of course, kids didn't really understand exactly what they were freaking out about at the time, but they knew that Nintendo had never failed them before. So when the company told kids to get excited, it meant that something really big was on the way. When kids finally played the first Virtual Boy demo in Toys R Us and other stores, they didn't know what to make of it. The Virtual Boy was more than awful, it was practically unplayable. Kids were expecting the Virtual Boy to look like the Super Nintendo, but no, absolutely not. Instead, the graphics were this nauseating shade of red that you had never seen in your entire life, pitted against a completely black background. It was just unnatural. The graphics were more than just bad, they were physically painful to look at. Looking into the Virtual Boy was like staring directly into a high-power laser. The craziest part is that the console had been so hyped that kids thought that something must have been wrong with them for not enjoying it at all. They kept playing and playing the Virtual Boy over and over again, just trying to find one good thing to say about it. But there was nothing. Some of the kids lied anyway and said that the system looked good to them, but it was kind of like a video game version of the Emperor's New Clothes. Deep down, everyone knew better. The graphics were so bad that kids were throwing up and going into seizures. When you looked away from the screen, sometimes you would still see the red wire imprints on your vision. There was a game called Red Alarm in particular that was basically like playing Star Fox while suffering from a cluster headache. The only game that was even halfway decent looking on the Virtual Boy was Mario Tennis, and even that looked like some sort of Nintendo hell most of the time. Seriously, the red background made it seem like Mario and Bowser were frying in the afterlife. It was like you had been sent there too, as a punishment for even playing this console. You're lucky that we ever forgave you for the Virtual Boy, Nintendo. So lucky. Good luck with the new Switch, and please don't ever do that to us again. Thanks for checking out this video. Since you watched the whole thing, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that like button. Subscribe as well if you want, since we upload a new gaming countdown each week. See ya.